There's something weird going on with the British economy. The nature of the British debt is changing, and that is posing a great threat to the British economy. In fact, it's making the British debt much worse than the US debt that stands at around $37 trillion. And I don't see a lot of people talking about it. But to understand how the British debt is changing and is posing such a great threat to the British economy, we still have to slightly understand how the British debt works in the first place. Now, if you look at the history of the UK debt to GDP ratio, you will see that it wasn't always this bad. For a very long time, the British economy has been paying off its debt, and in the early 2000s, the debt to GDP ratio was even 35%, which is extremely low. It's normal to have some kind of a debt. Just like for the people, if you have a mortgage, it's absolutely fine. We do not consider that as bad debt. However, because the British economy was overexposed to the US economy back in the early 2000s, when the subprime mortgages collapsed in the United States, it forced the British government to save its own economy by borrowing so much money. And that's where the real problem actually came in. And today, the British government is spending around 10% of the entire budget, or the entire spending in this case, at servicing the debt, at around £116 billion. Now, if we take this number and if we compare it to 2019, that's where the real problem actually starts. Because back in 2019, only 5% of the entire budget used to be spent on servicing the debt. And when I say that you're spending so much money on servicing the debt, I don't mean that you're paying off a portion of your debt. Nobody's talking about paying off the debt. We're simply talking about paying the interest on the debt. So imagine that you have a mortgage and you have to make, a $2,000 payment every month in order to pay off that mortgage within a period of 30 years. But instead of paying $2,000, you're only paying, let's say, $800 per month just to service that mortgage so that nobody takes that house out of you. This is exactly what I'm talking about. And because the nature of the British debt is changing, this number is about to explode. And that means that the British government might have to raise taxes. And at this point, I have no idea how on earth they will raise taxes. Will you impose a wealth tax? Well, I explained in one of the previous videos why that is a disastrous idea. See, debt by itself isn't actually bad. And you have two types of debts. You have short-term debt, which is really bad. And then you have long-term debt, which is actually great. Now, take yourself as an example. If you're borrowing credit card debt, that is really bad. It has very high interest rate, and then you have to pay it in the short term. And if something goes wrong, let's say you get fired from your job, you get sick and something goes wrong, and you won't be able to pay that debt, and then that debt starts to accumulate. On the other side, if you have a mortgage, you're not worried about it. In fact, if you have a mortgage, it's great. You have a roof over your head. Even though that you have to make these monthly payments on your mortgage, you know that you're actually building equity in your house. And that's why if you have long-term debt, it's also really great. If you're going through a crisis and then suddenly the government borrows money at a low interest rate for 30-year period, it's great. You solve the crisis right now and then you will pay that debt over the next 30 years. You can literally restructure the economy, lower taxes in the short run to grow the economy, and over time, as the size of the economy grows, you pay off that debt. On the other side, if the government is filled with short-term debt, that's where the real problem starts. Let's say suppose that the British government borrows money at certain interest rate. And then the time comes in, it's time to pay off the debt. If it's 30 years from now, nobody actually cares about that because who knows what will happen in 30 years. But if it's 2 years from now you have to pay off the debt. But if you cannot pay off the debt, then you have to refinance it. And the only way to refinance it is to do it through the rates that you have in the market right now. So if you borrow the debt when interest rates were, for example, 1%, and now interest rates are 5%, you are going to refinance the exact same debt at a much higher rate. So maybe 2 years ago you could afford that debt. Today you can't. But there is no other option because you're not paying off your debt. You're simply refinancing that debt. Let's say you refinance that debt at a higher interest rate, 5%. What happens next? 2 years passes and then you have to refinance it again. Either you pay it, which you cannot possibly do that, and you refinance it. And if interest rates are not in your favor, now you got yourself into a much bigger debt problem. And that's the real mistake that the British government did over the last 20 years, since 2008, I would say. Let's take a look at the real example of how exactly it worked. So if you look at the debt to GDP ratio, you see that the debt exploded back in 2009. It's very clear on the data. And if you look at the interest rates of the Bank of England, you see that they were brought down to almost 0% or 0.5% in 2009. So when interest rates were extremely low, the British government decided that we can actually afford all that debt. And that's why they borrowed so much money. Because they were like, if we're going to borrow trillions of dollars in 30 years from now, who knows what will happen in 30 years? In 30 years, inflation will keep rising so much that debt will become absolutely worthless. Let me give you another example. Between 2020 and 2022, the British government wanted to do the exact same thing. We are going to borrow massive amounts of debt from the public at low interest rate, a 30-year period, and we are going to get out of this pandemic. Because this pandemic cannot possibly last 30 years. It will last a year, 2, 3, maybe 4. But then we'll get out of it and we'll start slowly paying off our debt. However, nobody was willing to provide the British government 30-year bonds at such a low interest rate. Nobody was willing to bet his money on the British government that it will get it back in 30 years from now and will be receiving for the next 30 years such a low interest rate. And that forced the British government to rely on short-term government bonds. Yes, the bond only provides you with 1% interest rate, but this bond is going to expire in 2 years from now. 2 years from now, I will get my money back plus 1% interest rate from the British government. So even though that it's not literally the best investment out there, I would actually make it because I'm still getting some kind of cash flow instead of keeping that money in the bank. And 2 years from now, I will get my money back. And that forced the British government to take a lot of short-term debts in order to get out of the pandemic. But that debt was taken when interest rates were extremely low. When we have increased the interest rate because there was massive inflation, those 2-year government bonds, 3-year government bonds, or 4-year government bonds started to expire, and they're still expiring right now. But the government does not have the money to pay off these debts. What exactly does the government do in these circumstances? Exactly, refinance the debt. But if you refinance the debt right now, you're going to refinance it at the market rate. Don't we have a free market economy? And in the free market right now, interest rates are extremely high. They are way above 0% interest rate that they were back in 2020. So the exact same loans that the British government borrowed between 2020 and 2022 are now being refinanced at 5 times the interest rate. Back in the days, they might be 0.5%, 1%. Now they are 5%, 5.5%. Even though that the rates have been dropped slightly, they're still above 4%. Which means that the exact same loans that the government could afford in 2020, they cannot afford them today, but they still have to refinance them because they got themselves into this debt trap anyways. And that is why the amount of money out of the budget that is being allocated to servicing the debt is rising. And that was something that the British government did not expect. I mean, if you did the math and if you thought about it during that time, you would have expected it. But politicians usually are short-sighted. They don't think about long-term implications. I'm in office, we have a pandemic, I'm gonna borrow money to save the people. And what happens after that, I don't care about that. And this kind of a political mentality that forced the British government into such a debt. And that's why if you look at the British debt, you see that it's changing. Before 2020, most of the British debt was long-term debt. Yes, it wasn't all like 30-year bonds, but it was pretty much like 15 years plus, or even median type of debt, which is 7 to 15 years. However, something fundamentally changes in 2020, and the amount of ultra-short debts, which is anything between 0 to 4 years, have risen dramatically, and it's being refinanced every single year from now onwards. And as long as interest rates stay high, that debt will be refinanced at a higher interest rate. Especially we are in such an environment right now where investors are not willing to bet their money, understanding that inflation is high. Why would they accept an interest rate, a yield on treasuries or the government bonds in this case, of 2 to 3% when inflation is over 3%? According to the Bank of England itself, the inflation in the UK is like 3.7%, and house prices are rising much faster than inflation, which means that I would be much safer investing my money in the housing market than giving it to the British government anyways. In other words, you can say that the British government got itself into a position where it have accumulated or maxed out one credit card, and instead of paying that one first credit card, it got another credit card. Now it maxed out the second credit card. Now instead of actually trying to be prudent and trying to be disciplined and pay off these two credit cards, it started getting a third credit card. And now it maxed out the third credit card. And now it has a bunch of credit cards that it maxed out and has to pay them, but it doesn't know where to get the money from. So that leaves the British government with a couple of options. When you have a combination of short-term debt and then you're running a deficit of probably 150 to 200 billion pounds, and then you have high inflation that does not allow you to borrow money at low interest rate, you have two options. Number one, you are going to raise taxes to close that deficit. But I don't see what kind of taxes that you can raise. And that's why you have this ideas that is being thrown in the media that maybe the UK should introduce a wealth tax. But again, a wealth tax is not going to help anybody, and it's not going to solve any problem. But there is a second option, and that option is to print money. When you print money, you devalue previous debt. And when I say print money, that means that the Bank of England is going to print money and is going to buy all of these government bonds from the British government at a low interest rate over the next 30 years. So if we don't have real investors in the free market to buy all of those government bonds from the British government, or to loan their money to the British government at a low interest rate, let the Bank of England loan all of that money to the British government and the problem is solved. But if you do something like that, you are going to hurt the debtors, which means that inflation is going to rise, which means that the amount or the value of their money is going to go down. Yes, it's a short-term fix, but in the long run, that is sending a message to investors that the British government is no longer a reliable partner. So for example, imagine you have a friend and you've been friends for a year and this guy never asks you for money. And then suddenly he will come and ask you, John, can you please give me $1,000? And then you give him $1,000 and he pays you back the next day. You're like, oh, John is a really great guy. I trust him. So next time when he comes back to ask for money, you give him the money again because last time you gave him a loan and he gave you back. And then suddenly once upon a time, he comes and asks you, John, can you please give me $10,000? And you're like, no problem. I'm going to give you $10,000 if you promise to give it back the next week. And he says, of course, I will give it back to you. And then a week passes, then your friend tells you that, listen, I'm not going to give your money back. Would you trust him again? Of course not. And it will take years for the person to rebuild its reputation. The exact same logic applies to governments. If the British government is going to take this step, then it's going to destroy its credit score, which means that investors would no longer trust the British government and would no longer provide the British government with cheap loans. And when I say cheap loans, I mean like buying the treasury bills or the government bonds, in this case of the British government, at an interest rate of below 5%. Nobody's going to do that. They will treat the British government the same way as they treat the Venezuelan government. And I see this problem as the biggest problem that the UK is facing because there isn't an easy solution. The only great solution is to raise the economy to such an extent where tax revenues will grow dramatically and you can pay off the short-term debt. Or you can raise the taxes even when the economy is not growing. And the nuclear solution is to print money. And I'm really afraid that the politicians will take this path because this path and this option looks very easy. It's so seductive. It can solve the problem instantly. But in the long run, it can have devastating impact on the entire economy. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.